Okay, let's go. We're white against Isola. Let's get a d4, and I want to play something positional. I want to focus in this part of the speed run on positional concepts. So d4, e6, this is a very commonly misunderstood move. Obviously, black allows a transition into the French defense. But if you don't play 1 e4, then there's no need and really no point in transitioning into the French, because you don't know, maybe your opponent does play the French against d4. So if you're a d4 player and you want to play main lines, you just go c4 anyway. There's no reason not to. Okay, he goes d6, so this is already very weird. d6 and e6. I mean, I hope he's not going to start trolling us. So just like in e4 openings, you handle this in exactly the same way. You occupy a part of the center, and then you develop your pieces quickly. Now, there's a couple of ways to proceed here. We can go e4 and control more of the center, or we could just develop our knights. It doesn't matter. Let's just go knight c3, test the waters. Let's see what he does. Okay, bishop e7. Very passive. Nothing horrible about what he's doing. It's just tremendously passive. So I would propose going e4 and building up a 3-pawn center. And, you know, we're trying to punish him. But as I always say, there's a balance to be found between controlling the center with pawns and then developing our pieces. So we could toe the line by playing f4. I would probably play f4 in one of my games. But what I recommend to players in this rating range is to try to master that balance and to not push that envelope. It's much better to make sure that your pieces are developed and your center is well protected than to go crazy and start occupying the center with 5 or 6 pawns and then get overextended. So let's not reinvent the wheel here. Let's just go knight f3 and develop our pieces casually. c6. Okay, so he continues to play very weird moves. So how should we continue? Who can propose a follow-up means of development? Where should we put our pieces? Again, let's play as unoriginally as possible. Just put pieces on reasonable-looking squares. Yeah, I would prefer bishop d3. Because this bishop, I don't know where it's going to go. Here's the thing. If he plays knight f6, this bishop might want to jump out to g5, right? That should make sense. So, it should also make sense that we are delaying the development of this bishop until he puts his cards on the table. But this bishop on f1, we don't need to delay its development because we already know where it can go. And the reason I prefer d3 over e2 largely concerns itself with the fact that on d3 it controls the e4 pawn. And if we later play e5, I've described this idea before, you can imagine that it's going to be aiming at the h7 pawn. So it has, in other words, a lot of potential energy. Okay, so now we castle. I'm going to play that move pretty quickly. Yeah, so, we need to be very patient against these kinds of setups. Because if we strike in the center too early, maybe some of you are like, let's go after him, let's go d5. d5 looks very good, but I don't think it's that good after e5. It just allows him to close down the center. So remember that you only have oftentimes one sort of try when you're trying to punish your opponent. And so you want to be well prepared for it. You don't want to strike willy-nilly and prematurely. So what kind of move comes to mind which might gear you up for the center getting open? And I think one of you has already proposed it. Let's put the rook on e1. Not only does it help prepare the move e5, but if we play d5 and the center opens up, our rook is going to be well poised. Okay, so he goes g5, and now the time has come to step on the gas pedal, right? Clearly, he's continuing to abandon his development, and this is how intuition works. My intuition is now screaming, all right, Daniel, you got to do something. If we don't do anything, I mean, he is going to go g4, and the opportunity train is going to, stop at the station, and then it's going to pass on forward. So we have, 2 realistic ways of breaking through in the center. We can go d5 or e5. d5, I just pointed out, is not very good because he can go e5. Now, who can explain to me why e5, d5 is a better version of the position for white than, correspondingly, us playing d5 and him playing e5? That can be a little bit difficult to perceive. It's an instructive difference. I'm going to play e5 in the meantime because of the time situation. And I anticipate him playing d5. So we keep the center pawns. We block the development of the knight on g8. It cannot go to f6. That's very significant, right? and we open up more of the position after d5, cd, cd, we open up the c file. And also, this sort of French structure is just a lot more desirable for white than the sort of King's Indian structure that would have arisen after d5, e5. I'll show this after the game. But this should be intuitively clear to most people. All right. So we have many good moves here. White is positionally just completely winning here. His bishop is dead. This is like a horrific French. A lot of you are thinking about knight b5. Knight b5 is a good move. Nothing wrong with it. But he would drop his queen back, for example, to b8. And I think it would be premature to go to d6. Remember, he's got a bishop on e7 that's guarding that square. So again, in such positions, it often pays to play either very prophylactically, take the sting out of whatever threats he has remaining, or play very simple chess. You don't have to do something crazy or unoriginal. In fact, I think the strongest players often play such positions in the simplest possible manner. You bring out pieces, you put them on good squares. So I have two ideas. The first is to go bishop d2 or bishop e3. Bishop d2, believe it or not, is kind of a blunder. Who can tell me why? You have to be attentive to every source of danger. He's got a pawn on g5. I'm keeping an eye on it. Where can it go? I can go to g4. This knight has only one escape square on d2. So maybe you guys are thinking now, well, maybe it's worth playing h3 and stopping g4 first. But I'm not sure that's a very efficient use of our resources. g4 is not dangerous provided that we keep the d2 square alive. And so I like bishop e3. I also like queen a4, as many of you are indicating, just to tie up this knight. Let's start with bishop e3. Let's start with the most flexible move. And we're not playing this move to get this bishop active. We're playing this move to get the rook involved in the game with rook c1, which is what we're now doing. And look at how well coordinated our pieces are and how paralyzed he is. We're going to have to speed up our pace a little bit. Queen a5. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm looking for inroads into his position. We might be tied into the queen side, but let's look at the king side as well. Does he have any weak squares on the king side? Well, wouldn't we want a queen to drop on h5 just to attack him from the other side? That's just something which my pattern recognition kind of revealed, because I've done this before. So we play knight d2 on our own volition in order to pave the way for queen h5, and that's going to be devastating. His position ultimately is going to collapse from one side or the other side. There's going to be tactics that start manifesting themselves here. Queen h5. If he goes b4, we have a pretty sexy sequence. Now, what am I thinking about as I put my queen on h5? I'm already thinking about a particular tactic here. First of all, thank you, long shot. I'm thinking about the idea of doing something along this diagonal because this is a pin. And what is it that we could do? Well, we could attack the f7 pawn directly. I don't see how yet. But there is a very common tactical pattern removing the guard. As many of you were indicating, the idea, which is a threat, of knight takes d5, e takes d5, and then e6. That is a very, very typical pattern in such situations. So, and the other typical pattern is to sack the bishop, which is bishop g6, basically breaking the chain and infiltrating then with the queen, which is a little bit riskier. Another very simple idea, by the way, guys, if you consider the other benefits of putting the queen on h5, what is the other thing that the queen is doing, which may seem completely insignificant? It might seem like, okay, who cares about this thing? But if I forced you to make another observation about what the queen is accomplishing, it's pinning the h pawn. Again, who gives a care about that? Well, I do, because this g5 pawn could be suffering as a direct result of that, if perhaps we can take it with our bishop. Not yet, because he's going to take back. He's made an excellent move, knight f8. It's a good defensive move. And we have many different ways of proceeding here. Many different ways of proceeding. We can go knight b3 and transfer our knight, somewhere to c5. But as many of you guys are indicating, I love the move knight back to f3, simply threatening to capture on g5 and break through. And we're basically forcing his queen back to d8. So his position is very hard to crack. I mean, he's doing a phenomenal job of defending, but if we keep, the gas pedal, foot on the gas pedal, we're eventually going to find some inroads into his position. We don't have to rush. He's totally paralyzed. And, if your opponent defends against the immediate threats, the only thing that you can do is find ways to accumulate the pressure and simultaneously look for tactics on every move. So both things are important. Okay, rook h10, there comes the collapse. That's obviously a blunder. Now, notice how I'm not taking immediately. I'm just taking a moment. Okay, do I have any better moves? I don't see anything better. Let's just take. And once the first material losses are sustained, now you need to strike while the iron is still hot, okay? The king side is now a lot more weakened now that the rook is gone. So immediately the question you should be asking yourself is, well, do I have the capability of opening up, ripping open the king side, particularly because his queen is God knows where on the other side? And of course we do. We have the move h4. I know that some of you might be thinking, but aren't we weakening our king? And remember my analogy in such cases. If a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there, nobody hears it, does it produce a noise? He has literally no firepower anywhere near our king. Our king can take its clothes off and chill, on the balcony of his castle. We don't care. We literally don't care. Okay, b4. So obviously we can even take on g5 perhaps and sack the knight. No need for us to do that. Why not just drop the knight back? Okay, so he takes on a2. This I don't give a damn about. We just play hg. And now we're threatening just to break through with g6 and win the game. That's what's going to happen. He's going to take b2, I think, and then we're going to go g6. Now notice that I'm not playing gh. Gh is fine, but g6 you get more bang for your buck because you're forcing this f7 pawn to collapse, which was, if you remember, which was our initial plan. So we are able to extract the benefit, both benefits from the queen being on h5. First we attack the g5 pawn, and now we extract the secondary benefit, which is the queen's pressure on f7, or the primary benefit, depending on how you're looking at it. Okay, so very patient. Don't grab the pawn on f7 immediately. Wait a minute, the knight's defending. We need to take the knight first. Doesn't matter which piece we take it with. Just take with the knight. Don't lose sleep over these kinds of things. This is a bit of an obscure weakness that I see in some players, is these very insignificant decisions they will spend a very long time on. There are some things that objectively do not matter, and objectively you kind of need to eeny, meeny, miny, mo. The only reason I took with the knight was because the queen and the knight are objectively the stronger attacking tandem, but both moves would have been good. Okay, now we just start taking everything. Queen takes e6. And it's going to be checkmate in a couple of moves. On the next move, we're going to take that knight with check, and then we're going to see where that leads. Okay, so we have checkmate in 2 after he plays king d7. Who can find the mate in 2? It was very pretty sequence. Checkmate in 2 moves. Little bit of practice. Now, of course, if you don't see mate, you can just take on d5 and take the last rook. But as many of you are indicating, e6 check forces the king to d6. And it is the bishop, and I love when this happens. A piece that sort of was sitting dormant for most of the game. All of a sudden, it's like being the lab partner and doing all the work, but then your partner who did nothing gets all the glory. Except in this case, that's kind of a good thing. That was a very pretty game, yeah. That was nice. And I think it's a good lesson in, thank you for the 100, in, how to punish passive, but not trolly passive, just passive, very passive opening play. So one of the benefits of e4 openings over d4 openings, there's less of the stuff that my opponent played in e4 openings, because if you kind of try to do the same thing, if you play an analogous sequence of moves, you're going to get crushed a lot faster, because how should I explain it? Your play is oriented more toward the king side, so you're less likely to get away with something like this. There's going to be quicker central breakthroughs than there are in d4 openings. So if you're a d4 player, it really is important to know how to break down this kind of passive play, because this will also be applicable in legitimate openings that tend to be on the passive side, such as the Old Indian or certain cramped openings. Just knowing how to play in those positions is important. All right, so e6, c4. Again, if you play both d4 and e4, it makes sense, and you're confident in your abilities in the French, you can play e4 and transpose. But we kept the integrity of the sort of d4 opening. So here, by the way, there's a very interesting system, bishop b4 check, which is not really a Nimzo Indian, it's sort of a cross. And this has its own theory. I mean, And actually, it has quite a lot of theory. This may or may not transpose into one of several openings. This may be a Bogo Indian. You know, it may be its own opening, maybe a Nimzo Indian. Something to investigate if you're looking for some cool sidelines for black and you're okay playing the French. Not really the Raven. I'm not really sure what you're getting. So d6 again is obviously passive. Knight c3, e4. This is all normal. Knight f3. And again, f4, very much possible as an alternative, but we decided to adopt a more moderate approach. c6, bishop d3, h6, castle. This is self-explanatory, but you guys can ask questions about this part of the game if you'd like. So, yeah, so queen c7, rook e1. Now, why, again, let me address very quickly the point. Why are we, first of all, why are we not playing bishop f4? There was a specific reason I didn't like bishop f4. And if this reason didn't exist, then we would have done it. Does anybody... Well, there's two reasons, actually. And, can somebody name one of them? Yeah, so the first one is e5. So we walk into this move, which almost transposes into sort of an old Indian. And the second is g5 on a similar note. And, you know, these positions you could get in trouble in if you're not careful. Very quickly, he's already threatening h4 and stuff. And, you know, it can be easy to forget that even though he's very cramped, the pawns can still do the heavy lifting here, if that makes sense. So I didn't like that. And I didn't really like bishop e3 because it's a little bit... You know, we're blocking access to these central squares from our heavy pieces. And that's not what we're trying to accomplish here. So rook e1, right? We're delaying the pawn push. We're preparing e5. And we're waiting for him to show his cards. So if he goes knight f6, then we definitely go e5, striking in the center with tempo. Something like this could happen. Now we go bishop f4. It's a different story. The knight on g4 is stuck. We're threatening h3. So how do I know not to push yet? Well, you can calculate. I mean, you can look at d5 and conclude that after e5, nothing good happens. You can calculate e5, and you can see that this simply blunders a pawn. So this isn't like a mysterious intuition. The intuition is based on very specific evaluation. But I'm also instinctively going rook e1. I'm not literally always calculating these options. g5 and e5. So there's a very common dictum in chess which says... If your opponent plays on the flank, you strike in the center. I'm sure you guys have probably heard of this many times. And it's, you know, among principles, it's one of the best principles. It holds true a tremendous amount of time, you know, a large majority of the time. And where does it stem from? Well, it stems from the fact that if your opponent is playing on the flank, not only is he probably making weaknesses, but probably also, you know, diverting attention from the center of the board. So I think it's quite an intuitive principle. So e5, this no longer blunders a pawn. That's why we went rook e1 and d5. So if d takes e5, who can tell me which way would we have captured on e5? Important question. And here you have to be concrete. Calculate. Yeah, I'm glad to hear. Thank you for Formidable Blue. Blue, yeah. Knight e5, yeah. Not de. Don't allow g4. Separating the knight from the pawn. This is fine for white, but why allow it when you can just take with the knight? And look at the diagonal that has been also created by the queen. The light squares are tremendously weak. Just like in the game, the d6 square, we would try to get the knight involved. I mean, this is just absolutely horrendous, quite like in the game. d5, ed. So if he had gone ed, we would have gone e6 probably. And broken through with far greater ease. So of course he went cd. Thank you, Formidable Blue. Formidable Blue for the 5 gifted. I really appreciate it. Damn girl. My man. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you. And I think the most instructive part of the game was here, because I think that a lot of players struggle with patience in these types of positions, which is why a lot of you were tempted to go knight b5, a move that I don't dislike, but you know, it's not... I think this is... Knight b5 is the best move in this position, but I was trying to illustrate a larger concept, which is that, you know, in positions where your opponent is so out of counterplay, it really pays to complete your development and make moves that look very bland and boring so that you can, once the decisive invasion starts, you have the firepower necessary for everything to run smoothly. Thank you, Derek Wu. Now, knight b5 would have been very strong as well, because after something like queen b8, if we pay very careful attention to the c7 square, we might notice the move queen to c2. To be honest with you guys, I missed this move and I was looking at knight b5. And it's very hard for black to stop knight c7, because of course if bishop d8, then this square is weak. And king d8 is tremendous. I mean, that's probably what he would have what he would have had to do. But now that's a massive concession, obviously. No, there is a definite... I mean, weaknesses are squares that cannot be protected by pawns. But not all weaknesses are relevant. And to spot relevant weaknesses, you have to have a sense of where your pieces belong, right? And where your pieces are going to be fulfilling their maximal capabilities. And that is tied into pattern recognition and experience. Okay, so we decided on a more patient approach. Bishop e3, rook c1, and knight d2. So how did I know to play knight d2? So the thing is, I don't think the sack on d5 works. We've basically made all of the possible improving moves on the queen side. We've gotten the rook to c1, and one of the most common ways of winning such close positions where one side is totally out of counterplay is to switch your attention to the other side of the board. Even Aaron Nimzovich talked about this in my system. You do as much as you can on one side of the board, you distract your opponent's attention, and then you find weaknesses on the other side of the board and occupy those. And that's a form of a principle of two weaknesses. Your opponent gets overwhelmed, and ultimately this leads to some sort of tactical resolution. Hence knight d2. b5, queen h5. Had he played b4, we would have had a very pretty sequence of moves. Now, I mentioned in the game, of course, the idea of knight takes d5, e takes d5, e6. This should be very obvious to people. I mean, look at how crushing this is. But of course, knight takes d5 is impossible because of queen takes d5, right? But what if you were to ask yourself the Sam Shanklin question? What's the Sam Shanklin question? What happens if I do it anyway? Could we go knight takes d5 or not? Nice, we can still go knight takes d5 because of bishop e4. And this skewers the queen to the rook. Queen has to move somewhere. I mean, queen a5, queen a2 doesn't matter. We take the rook, the game is over. Not only have we won the exchange, but now the bishop is toast as well. So that was a very nice line. I was hoping this would happen. In addition, we could play knight b3, a little intermediate move, chasing the queen away from its protection of d5, and then still knight d5 and e6 is totally crushing. So we had an alternative if you didn't see that. Okay. So that didn't happen. He played knight f8. And now we go knight f3. This is totally winning. We are threatening to take on g5. Now, his last resort would have been to play queen d8. This was the most sensible. It's a sad move to play. And how would we have proceeded in this position? Well, there are a million ways to win this game. There's a million ways to get to the weaknesses in his position. The simple plan could be to double rooks on the c file. That comes to mind. Another maneuver that comes to mind is, this is going to be really cool. Knight b1. Who can tell me where the knight is going? It's going to c5. It's going to c5 to simply overwhelm black's resources, defensive resources. Black is paralyzed. If we can get this bishop out of the picture, then the pawn on g5 once again becomes very weak. Notice that this rook on h8 it's permanently undefended. It's not like he can engineer a situation where the rook is defended. So the pawn on g5 is going to be a permanent problem for him, which means if we can eliminate one of its defenders, either the bishop or the queen, once again we are going to renew the threat of knight g5 or bishop g5. So you can see how the two sides of the board are so interconnected. A piece that's you know, there's this bishop on e7, which is totally overloaded with 2 assignments. We're trying to continually overload it by putting a knight on c5. h4 doesn't do as much as it does in the game, because since he still has a rook, this doesn't achieve its desired effect. The rook on h8 still guards the h6 pawn. I don't think... It's not a bad move. I don't see why we would need to open the position up this quickly. Because if you compare this to the game where he blunders the exchange, now it's a much different story, because after he takes, here we can take on h6 and we can actually infiltrate the king side, tangibly. If you compare that to this position, his rook is still here. This should be pretty evident at this point. Why not knight g5? Well, if you calculate, you'll see that after bishop g5, he's not going to take with a pawn, but he is going to take with a queen, and he wins a piece. We don't have enough attackers on g5. Well, Zuku, but the problem with h4 isn't that it hangs a pawn. That's not the issue. The problem is that it doesn't achieve its desired effect. So you can prepare it all you want. Okay, great. But still, it's a little bit nebulous how you're going to now infiltrate. I guess you could move the king to h1 and go rook g1. Just seems to me to be a little bit of a clunky plan, although it's also totally possible. The position is so winning that basically anything leads to infiltration. So after he goes rook h7, we take... Oops, sorry. We take it, we go h4, b4 knight back to e2, and of course we don't care about any of the pawns here. It'll be like a millennium before his a-pawn gets anywhere near promotion. g6. Well, just like in a war, I mean, infiltration means to breach the enemy ranks, you know, whatever that may mean in a given position. Again, we don't play gh, we go g6, takes, we start taking everything, takes the knight, and then mate with e6 and bishop f4. So, I mean, this is all very simple. And that was the game. No, I think that was an instructive game. It was a nice game. And, yeah. I mean, once he gave up his rook, the only other instructive move was h4. The rest was very obvious. And this concept of striking when the iron is hot, right? That's another piece of advice I can share. If your opponent blunders something, particularly material, that next move after you take the material can be very important, because there might, you know, either your opponent by tilting will offer you an opportunity to expand your advantage, or because he's now lacking that material, you have to understand what bearing that has on the position. So maybe he's lost a bishop, and that bishop was defending a square, which can now be occupied by a knight. So don't simply take the material and then relax. Try to understand how the material gain has impacted the landscape of the position, if that makes sense. All right. The oh my landscape of the position. Well, at this point, black is totally lost. So at this point, I can't offer a good advice, but I wouldn't go into this opening, of course. But I would probably, if I were black, I would go e5. And I would go into an old Indian, like down a bunch of tempi. But this is still better than nothing. Once he allowed e5, he's basically busted here. There's too many weaknesses. Okay, guys. I would have loved to do another game, but I need to go to sleep. I've got a lot of work tomorrow. And I've had an exhausting day today. So we're going to call it. Thank you, everybody, for the support. Everybody who subs and supports the channel. Helps me with everything. I'm going to head out, guys. Take care, everybody.